Hello? Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our relevant talk. Can you all hear me okay with this mic? Awesome, awesome. Well, welcome hello? Yep, that's good. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's really awesome to see all of your wonderful faces, and for those tuning online, thank you for coming as well. Whether you're a member of one of our Christian fellowships or invited by a friend, we're so happy to see you here. And yes, there are snacks up there at the front. So we are currently having our last talk of the Relevance series. Now, the Relevance series here at the University of Toronto is an outreach that we're doing from January 12th to the 19th, which is today, and we've collaborated with several Christian campus fellowships and organizations. And so our intention is to promote dialogue and enable students who do not yet know the Lord to see the relevance of Jesus for all of life. And so we've had a bunch of different talks covering many different topics. And so we will have speakers today. And so today's topic is on God and science, friend or foe. And so we're going to be, well, first let me introduce myself. So you can put a name for this person right here. But my name is Cheryl. I'm currently a fifth year here at the University of Toronto. My programs are a little bit irrelevant, but I guess I'm doing a double major in molecular genetics, human bio, art history. But the more relevant part is our talk for today. Oh yeah, if you just came in, feel free to take a seat. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. And so if you're hearing about this for the first time, it's Indigenous protocol to really recognize and respect the Indigenous roots and cultures of the places that we are on. And so as Christian organizers of this event, we believe all land and all peoples were created by God. And we want to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto lies, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nations. And this is still home to many First Nations from across Turtle Island, and Turtle Island is referenced to North America. Now we thank these first people who continue to live on these lands and care for them, and whose relationship to these lands existed long before the founding of Canada. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. I'm gonna go on and move on to slide go. We can have the next slide. So something that we're going to be using today is a really cool tool called Slido. And so what is that? A QR code. What can you do with that QR code? Scan it if you would like. So with Slido, we're going to be inviting you to submit questions while the talk happens. So feel free to scan that, get that ready while we invite our speakers. Feel free to write any questions that you may have. If you notice that there are questions being submitted, feel free to give it a like if you think it's really interesting, because it will help bump it up to the very top. So that is going to be the tool we will use to connect with you as the audience to ask all your questions relating to God and science. All right. Now I'm going to be introducing our wonderful speaker. So we have Dr. Ewan Goligher. Sorry, my slides here. Who has an MD PhD and is an intensive care physician and assistant professor of medicine and physiology at the University of Toronto. As a researcher, he studies new treatments and support strategies for patients with respiratory failure, and he also writes and speaks on medical ethics and the relationship between Christian faith and science. And he lives in Toronto and attends Christchurch, Toronto. So let's give a big warm welcome to our speaker here.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be invited to address this topic with you this evening. Faith and science is a common area that raises questions for both Christian believers and unbelievers alike. And so this evening we have an opportunity to wrestle through some of those issues. Now there's many different issues that we could talk about. It's just echoing just a bit. I don't know. There's many different issues that we could address, but over the next 20-25 minutes or so, I thought I'd begin by addressing specific areas where faith and science are thought to be fundamentally in conflict. Not so much about what they claim about the world, but rather about the way they approach the world. Their kind of methodological approach to the world. And so it's the case that not only do people say that the claims of faith and science contradict one another, but also the methods or approaches to knowledge of faith and science contradict one another. And in this sense, it raises the question, can you be a Christian and a scientist and have any kind of intellectual integrity? So it's customary when we present in science to begin by acknowledging our conflicts of interest, our competing interests. And so I want to be very honest with you that I have substantial competing interests this evening. I am both a Christian believer and a scientist. So if it turns out that you can't reconcile the two, you can't have intellectual integrity, that would be a big problem for me. It'd be very costly. I'd either have to give up being a scientist or I'd have to give up being a Christian. And both of those are very important to me. As I've been a Christian for 30-on years, I'm very involved in my church. In fact, I'm an elder in my church, so I try to be a role model and a pastor to others on their spiritual journey. And so being a Christian disciple is kind of fundamental to my identity. But at the same time, I'm a practicing physician and researcher. I dedicate most of my life to scientific endeavor. I train graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, medical students, residents on the art and science of pursuing new ways of understanding disease and how to treat them. So that's also incredibly important and significant in my life. So I have a profound competing interest this evening because if I'm wrong and the two can't be reconciled, that would be very costly for me. And so everything that I say with that should be taken with that potential competing interest in view. There's a potential for me to be biased in approaching this issue because it would be so costly for me to be wrong. And I want you to bear that in mind. So with that said, let's think about two potential contradictions between faith and science. And the first one is that faith and science are sometimes held to be contradictory modes of belief. So what do I mean by that? Well, the contradiction is thought to be that, well, science is really all about evidence-based belief, and religion is really all about faith-based belief. And those seem very different ways of approaching the world. So, for example, faith is sometimes understood to entail blind trust or belief despite evidence. And a famous atheist and famous scientist, Richard Dawkins, said, quote, "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, or even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." So that seems very contradictory to the scientific way of thinking, which is supposed to be all about evidence, about data, about transparency, about honest judgment, about openness to being wrong, about testing hypotheses and subjecting them to efforts to refute them. So science seems about rigor, about data, about evidence and experimentation. Religion seems to be, it's so said to be the case that it's really just about blind trust. But I want to suggest to you that that purported contradiction is really a kind of false dilemma, because it basically misunderstands what we mean by faith when we talk about faith in Christianity. And I want to suggest that although sometimes faith can be blind trust or belief despite evidence, faith can also be warranted trust. So for example, when you go to see the doctor and you say you have such and such symptoms and get examined and they find such and such signs and make certain diagnosis, they're the ones with the expertise and authority to say what the problem is. And you kind of have to take it for granted that they'll tell you the truth and that they'll be right and they'll be professionally competent to arrive at a diagnosis. Now, of course, these days, the great thing is you can go online, you can check things out, you can check out other sources. But at the end of the day, you put a great deal of faith in the institution of medicine when you go to see the doctor to get a diagnosis and treatment. And that is faith because you're putting your trust in what they're telling you. Now, it's not foolish. In fact, I think it's incredibly wise. But it nevertheless is an act of faith. Here's another example. When you board a plane, you're putting a lot of faith in a lot of other people that you've never met. Strangers up in front are going to be flying that thing through the air at 40,000 feet at 600 miles an hour. And engineers that you've never met designed that plane. Mechanics you've never met maintain that plane. And every once in a while, our confidence in the airline industry gets just a little bit shaken, like when a door blows off the side of a plane mid-flight, like happened just a few weeks ago in the United States. But it highlights the fact that most of the time, most of us get on a plane and take off without a second thought because we have great faith in what the airline industry offers in terms of quality and reliability. And even the same kind of faith is very much operative in science. So if you're searching the literature and you want to find out, what sort of mechanisms of certain biological phenomena are, and you find a useful article and you read the article, you see the data, you see how the data is analyzed, presented, the plots, the Western blots or the statistics, figures, whatever kind of methods you're interested in using, you'll explore that. But at the end of the day, you're putting great faith in the journal as an institution and its editorial processes. You're putting great faith in the system that the authors would report reliable data in meaningful ways, honestly and transparently. And every once in a while, our faith in these things gets rocked when we find that people don't actually act in honorable and trustworthy ways. And it reminds us just how much faith in general we put in the institution. Now, is that foolish faith? Is that blind faith? Is that the kind of, does Richard Dawkins himself exercise that kind of faith? Well, of course he does. He's an eminent scientist who relies on the publications of others all the time. So really then there's two kinds of faith. Maybe there's blind trust, maybe there's belief despite evidence, but there's also potentially warranted trust. So the question becomes, specifically with respect to Christian belief at least, what kind of faith does Christian belief call you to? And I would just want to read you a few scriptures to emphasize that the kind of belief that Christians have really falls under the category of warranted trust or evidence-based trust. So here are the words of the Apostle John, 1 John chapter 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. Now, of course, in reading that to you, I'm putting my faith in the reliability of some very ancient manuscripts, and that's a conversation we can have afterwards. But the point is that the kind of faith that John was calling his disciples to, he wasn't saying, just believe what I say. He was saying, guys, I've seen it. I've touched the word of life, and that's what I'm proclaiming to you. It was evidence or warranted trust. These are the words of Jesus when the disciples of John the Baptist came to him asking if he was the Messiah. And Jesus replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. He was saying, look at what's happening all around. Now again, we have to trust the witness of these records, these ancient writers, and that's an important issue for you to examine when you're deciding whether to put your trust in the Christian faith. But Jesus himself didn't just say to John's disciples, look, I said it and that's enough. I'm the Messiah, full stop. No, he said, look around at what's going on. And each of these phrases that he uses about the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, those who have leprosy being cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead raised, the good news proclaimed to the poor, each of those actually was freighted with prophetic significance. John the Baptist would have known what the Old Testament prophets said to expect about the Messiah. And Jesus is saying, I'm fulfilling those prophecies. So he's not asking John's disciples just to believe blindly. He's giving them evidence that would have been very weighty to them. So the question really becomes, does the available evidence warrant trust in Christ? And Christian belief is not the kind of belief that says, just believe. It says, examine the evidence and decide whether trust is warranted or not. And that's totally consistent with a scientific approach to belief. But, I have ventured so far as to raise the idea of miracles here. And that raises a second potential contradiction between the way of faith and the way of science. And that is that they can sometimes be referred to as contradictory modes of explanation. So the purported conflict here is that science is all about natural mechanism, natural law, observable, empirical, testable processes, and those are the only kinds of explanations that are permitted. And on the other hand, religious believers are taught to see the hand of God at work everywhere. I mean, when we worship every Sunday, we praise God for his goodness, his kindness, his love, his protection, his provision. So we are attributing all kinds of experiences of everyday life to a creator God whom we love and serve. And that's a very different mode of explanation of what happens around us. Now, I can assure you that as someone who supervises graduate students, if I sat down in a graduate seminar or in a thesis exam and the graduate student said, at the end of the day, I attribute all of what I'm observing here in the lab to the hand of God, that would not be a thesis that would pass muster, because that's not good science. That's not what science is about. So the question is, why not? Why not? If I'm a Christian and I believe in God and see the hand of God everywhere, how can I, on the one hand, accept that in church, but not accept it when I'm sitting in the examination room? The other, and this also arises in the context of my medical practice, where I sit with patients and their families in the ICU where I work. I care for a lot of people at the end of their life, people on life support, often in tragic circumstances, and I sit with the family and I tell them, I honestly, I'm devastated to tell you this, but I think your loved one's not going to survive, and we have to start thinking about when we're going to take them off of life support. And often the families will say, but doctor, I'm praying for a miracle. And people will use that as a reason to persist on life support when we think actually we should stop. And the reason we want to stop is because in many ways, futile life support can cause a great deal of harm and suffering for the patient. And so I find myself conflicted between, yeah, God does miracles on the one hand, but yeah, the reality is your loved one's not going to make it, and we need to accept that and face reality. So you can see the tension here between faith and science as competing modes of explanation. Now, I would point out that at the end of the day, the conflict between science's emphasis on the natural and religion's emphasis on the supernatural is only really a conflict if science has to insist that all phenomena everywhere are always caused merely by natural mechanisms and natural laws, and that it's inappropriate to ever attribute anything to something outside of nature and natural process. And that is a belief system that's referred to as naturalism, also sometimes called materialism. The idea that all that is just physical matter, atoms and subatomic particles interacting, driving everything that exists, everything reduces to that, and everything is explainable in those terms, and therefore to refer to God is A, unnecessary, and B, not permitted. And a good example of naturalism is a statement by the eminent geneticist Francis Crick, where he said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So they're looking at these complex systems, they're seeing order, they're seeing kind of teleology, and they must constantly remind themselves, this is not designed, this is not designed, this is not designed, because it kind of looks that way naturally. And likewise, Richard Lewontin, another eminent geneticist, said, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So Lewontin is just being very honest. He's saying the rules are God's not allowed in. And so we have to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that allow us to explain everything that's going on without reference to God. But that's not because of the data, he says, not the methods and institutions of science. It's our a priori adherence to material cause. It's a belief system. But the truth is, naturalism and materialism, those aren't scientific hypotheses that are testable. Those are philosophical systems of belief. And you couldn't sit in a lab and test whether naturalism and materialism are true. They're not scientific claims. They're philosophies about life. just like, very much like a religion. And so so naturalism faces as much of competition between science as does the rest of religious belief. So how might Christians like me, who do science and practice faith, reconcile these natural and supernatural modes of explanation? Well, this is by reference to a fundamental concept differentiating between what we call primary causation and secondary causation. So when we talk about secondary causation, we're talking about the order of nature, natural mechanisms, natural laws, natural phenomena, all the usual things that we talk about in science where we can talk about pathways and this reaction leading to that reaction, or this risk factor increasing the risk of that disease, this cause, this effect, the kind of usual linkage between cause and effect that we think about in science. That's what we refer to by secondary causation. That's the internal natural system, the closed system of natural law that we think of when we talk about science. But underpinning secondary causation is the idea of primary causation. And by primary causation, we think about it with such as the divine upholding of all of nature. So when Christians think about God's relationship to nature and God acting in the world, we're not thinking about secondary causation. We're not thinking about God sort of messing with chemical reactions to change what happens. We're thinking about primary causation, the underlying upholding of the system. And this is exactly how Scripture speaks of God's work in the world. So for example, Hebrews chapter 1 says, Jesus upholds the universe by the word of his power. Or Colossians chapter 1 says that Jesus, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So the idea here is that it's all being held up and sustained continuously by the one who made it all to begin with. The whole system depends on him. And in Acts 17, very famously, the Apostle Paul was addressing a pagan audience of Greeks, and he explained to them that the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he gives everyone life and breath and everything else, for in him we live and move and have our being. This kind of dependence, this kind of God holding up everything going on is exactly what we mean by primary causation. So a way to think about the relationship between primary and secondary causation is very much like the relationship between an author and characters in the novel that she's writing. So if you're an author, you create a world in your imagination, you put it down on paper, you have this character doing that, and in that world, the characters are following the kind of contours of the world that you've created. That's what makes science fiction so interesting, for example. But ultimately, all that world depends on you as the author, and that's the difference. So there can be causation within the novel, but then there's causation underneath the novel, and that's the difference between secondary and primary causation. And the significance of differentiating between secondary and primary causation is that it actually allows us to explain the existence of the natural order. Just why is it that there are laws of nature that everything seems to obey? Why is it that we can predict things on the basis of the law of gravity in a very constant mathematical way? Why are there constants, gravitational constants, cosmological constants, that we can measure that things seem to insistently follow no matter what? Why are there 4 fundamental forces, and why are they always obeyed? Why is the law of thermodynamics always obeyed? This, most of the time, for a naturalist, is something that you just say, this is the way it is, without reference to any underlying explanation. It's a brute fact. But accepting brute facts is not good scientific practice. And when science really first took off, it took off because the people who practiced science expected law and order in nature. Listen to Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry. He said, God is the author of the universe and the free establisher of the laws of motion. Or Isaac Newton, he said, without all doubt, this world so diversified with that variety of forms and motions we find in it could arise from nothing but the perfectly free will of God directing and presiding over all. Albert Einstein, everyone who is seriously engaged in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that the laws of nature manifest the existence of a spirit vastly superior to that of men. And so if you're going to be honest with yourself, you see this regularity in nature. You don't even have to see miracles to see that God exists. It's the fact that nature behaves in such a regular and predictable way. It's the fact that it becomes accessible to our minds so that we can study it that is in and of itself a kind of miracle. So if anything, science and faith are not in contradiction. Science actually depends on God's continual upholding intervention. This means that miracles, although incredibly rare and something we ought to approach with great skepticism, it nevertheless can happen because they are simply God interacting with the world that he continuously upholds. And we have good reason to think that the natural order will generally prevail. For this reason, Scripture praises God for his steadfast love and his faithfulness. He is an unswerving God committed to the good of the order that he created. So I want to conclude simply by saying that with respect at least to modes of evidence and explanation, I honestly don't see any conflict between faith and science. There may be lots of other issues for us to talk about this evening, but with respect to the question of faith and whether faith is appropriate for a scientist, insofar as Christian faith is warranted trust, it's appropriate. And insofar as we recognize that God gives us an explanation for the order that we see in the world, then it's appropriate to see the natural and the supernatural at work at the same time. But the truth is that the idea that science depends on God raises some implications for all of us in this room, for who we are and for how we ought to live our lives. Listen to the words of Acts 17. This is Paul again speaking to his audience in Athens. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God has overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And the reality that the world that we inhabit, the world that we study, continually depends and is continually upheld by a creator and sustainer of all things implies for us an obligation to worship. If there is a God, we ought to worship him. And so I think many of us in the room, particularly if we're not already religious believers, naturally are resistant to this idea. We don't like the idea that there's a God. We don't like the idea that there's an authority over us. And at the beginning I said that I have a competing interest with respect to this issue of God and science. But I think the truth is that all of us have a competing interest with respect to this issue of God and science, because if we don't believe in God, the idea that there is a God means that we have to surrender some measure of autonomy. At the end of the day, we are not the final authority over how we live our lives. And that gives us a reason to want to deny the existence of God or want to deny that faith and science can be reconciled. So we have to be honest about all of our different competing interests this evening. So I would just want to close by asking the question, if it's the case that there is a God, and if it's the case that we would therefore have to worship him, and if it's the case that therefore we have to surrender our autonomy to him, recognizing that he is creator and we're a mere creature, what would make that worthwhile? What would be the point? What would be the value in doing that? Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy he went and sold all that he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. And so the question is, what's Jesus saying? What is it about the kingdom of heaven that's so great that makes it like a pearl of great price, or like a priceless field that you're going to go sell everything so that you can buy this field? What's the hidden treasure? Well, 3 things. True love, in being reconciled to the one who made you for himself. You find true joy and true happiness. The famous Christian church father Augustine said, our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. That's what's on offer for us if there is a God and if he loves us. True life. Romans chapter 2, God says, God will repay each person according to what they have done. To those who by persistence in doing good, seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. You know, I was struck by this. In some sense, the appeal of science, the appeal of being a great scientist, of winning a Nobel Prize, or all the other kinds of prizes, the way that science allows us to make a name for ourselves, part of the appeal of that is the idea of immortality. My name will be known and remembered forever. We look back and we think of the great scientists of ages past. We remember their contributions, and there's a kind of way in which they live on in our worlds. But here, knowing and serving and honoring God, we find the true immortality and the true glory with him forever that our hearts long for. And finally, true purpose. True love, true life, true purpose. In some sense, Christianity teaches that all of us were created to be scientists. The creation story teaches us that humanity was created to exercise dominion over the world God made. Not a harsh, wanton dominion where we just get our way and take advantage of the world God gave us, but rather a stewardship where we explore, understand, and exercise control over the world so that by understanding nature and bringing its mechanisms into our grasp, we discover and invent. That's our kingly role that God has given us. This is the reason Scripture refers to us as royal priests. Scientific endeavor and intellectual discovery is fundamentally part of the meaning for which we exist. Johann Kepler said, those laws, that is the laws of nature, are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. And I love the words of Proverbs 25, verse 2. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out. And as scientists, that's exactly what we are, kings and queens playing a royal role over the world that God made under him. And so I invite you all to dedicate yourself anew to science, not as opponents of God, but as servants of God. To seek God and to find him in Christ is the greatest discovery one can make. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doctor, for the really insightful talk. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a SlideGo form that we had earlier with the QR code. So if you had any more questions, feel free to take this time to write that. But we also have the feedback form and follow-up. So I also invite you to scan this wonderful QR code that we have up right now and fill it out for us, give us some feedback. We do relevant series every single year, so that would be really helpful for all of us organizing the event. All right, I'll probably spend like a minute or two, but I don't have any music. I can't a cappella, but do 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 do. Oh, thank you so much. All right, I hope you got some time to fill out the form. If you need more time, I'll give you 5 more seconds. But we do have something else that we would like to share. Something else that's been going on for us that here at U of T, we are going to be also starting a really cool course called Christianity Explored. Now, the whole point of us doing relevant series every single year is to really invite students, invite people in our community to learn more about Jesus. And so as Christian students here on campus and me personally, Jesus has done such a such a great thing in my life. I feel super transformed for everything that he has done, and I always love to share about him. And so if you were invited here by a friend, or if the talk tonight sparked your curiosity to learn more about Christianity, I would encourage you to learn more about Christianity Explored, and we have a video for that. So
You might be a convinced atheist, a committed Christian, or somewhere in between. Perhaps you've lots of questions to ask, or perhaps you're happier just sitting and listening. Maybe you go to church, or maybe you've never been. Whoever you are, Christianity Explored is a place for you to explore what life is all about. The Christianity Explored course is free, it's relaxed and informal, and it's run by ordinary people local to you. Some courses are held in churches with lots of people. Some are held in people's houses with just a few friends getting together. Wherever you meet, in each session, there's a chance to look at the life of Jesus for yourself and ask any questions you have. There's a short video to watch, and then a chance to chat about what you've just heard. You'll meet great people. You won't be asked to sing or pray or read out loud, and you don't need to know anything about the Bible to enjoy it. So whoever you are, come and explore. There's almost certainly a Christianity Explored course starting near you soon. So ask a Christian friend, or check out the website to find out more. You might just discover that the Christian message really is the best news you've ever heard.
And what a great news it is. But yeah, Christianity Explored, as the video mentioned, is a free, informal, and relaxed 7-week course. So yeah, if you know nothing about Christianity, don't worry. This is a great course to learn more about that as well. If you've never read the Bible or never prayed before, don't worry as well. This is supposed to be a course to invite you to learn more or ask any questions that you may have. All right, so that's a little bit about Christianity Explored. If you're interested, we have those starting January 25th, so that would be, next week, on Thursdays at 5:30 at Wycliffe College. So if you don't know, that's the building across Trinity. Trinity College, it's like this red brick building. And yeah, so we're going to be starting the course next week at 5:30 p.m. All right, so now we're going to be transitioning in our Q&A. I'm going to be inviting back our speakers here. So we have Dr. Goligher. Yes, Goligher. And we also have Glenn Taylor, who's going to be joining us. So Glenn Taylor is I'm going to pronounce emeritus professor, there we go, of the Old Testament at Wycliffe College here at the University of Toronto. He holds degrees from the University of Calgary, Dallas Theological Seminary, and Yale University, where he did his PhD in ancient Hebrew and related Semitic languages. In addition to Northwest Semitic languages, his academic specialties include the Book of Genesis, which is often raised in discussing science and the Bible. He is an ordained priest in the Anglican Church of North America, and his hobbies include cars of the 60s and 70s and doting on his 2 new grandchildren, Amelia and Hannah. Congratulations. All right, so thank you so much for joining us. Yes, let's give a warm round of applause here. And Dr. Goligher, does your mic work okay?
I think so, yep.
All right, so I'll probably invite you to use that mic. All right, so yeah, I will be receiving questions. So if you have any more questions, feel free to keep putting them on SlideGo. So our first question here is, how does Christianity reconcile with evolutionary biology? Or if not, how would a Christian dispute the accuracy of evolution? So whoever would like to speak first.
I've done a lot of talking already.
All right. Well, it's funny the person should mention that because one of the things that I did when I came is I prepared a handout that has several different Christian responses to evolution. And there are 3, and it's made by a friend of mine who's a professor of science and religion at the University of Alberta named Denny Lamoureux. And so if you wanted to take this sheet on the way, you'd get kind of a list of 3 options. One quickly is young earth creation, which has a very straightforward and literal understanding of the Bible and the story of creation, in which case there is seemingly a conflict with evolution pretty much right up. And then there's kind of a mediating position called progressive creation, which understands the account of creation kind of more categorically, that the 7 days represent longer periods of time. And then there are a number of Christians, and I include myself among these, who would consider themselves to be evolutionary creationists who don't see fundamentally any significant conflict between the story of creation in Genesis and evolution. So there are a number of different options, and I would just like to say that if you're only familiar with young earth creationism and you're finding that that is just hard for you to reconcile with your courses in anthropology, biology, whatever, that there are options that are held by Christians that you should look at. As Dr. Goligher was saying, ideally Christianity is not in conflict with scientific endeavor. And the church has been down that road before, once with Galileo, for example, when Christians had understood that the sun, that the earth was at the center and the sun revolved around the earth. And Christians kind of had to humble themselves and look at the Bible again, and that's what Christians are doing. Some see no conflict, some see the need for adjustment in that area.
Yeah. I mean, I would affirm the same thing. I mean, I personally, having as a Christian Scientist, feeling compelled to read a fair amount, not as a scholar or theologian like Dr. Taylor, but as an informed layman in theology, having read a lot of different Christian scholars on this, you really don't see any significant conflict between the Genesis account and the evidence that the universe is very old, that species have evolved over time. I think that in a lot of ways we can understand from the Genesis account that God's hand was behind and underneath all of those events. And so I think I personally feel very encouraged. In fact, increasingly, I think the evidence of science points toward belief in God. That's not really what I talked about at all this evening. But there is, for example, a wonderful book called The God Hypothesis that you can purchase at your local bookseller, which summarizes the growing and emerging evidence from cosmology and physics, from biology, from chemistry, all the ways in which science supports and strengthens one's belief in God. Even just the idea that there's a beginning to the universe is a huge problem for someone who doesn't believe in God. I mean, I know there are theories and hypotheses, but they almost feel a little bit like blind faith to me, because they're the idea of speculating that there's a million or infinite number of unobserved universes takes a fair amount of faith to believe as well. So just very briefly, I really don't see a significant conflict.
Oh, thank you for your...
Can I just add one quick thing to that?
Sure.
Everybody assumes that the book of Genesis is meant to address scientific questions. But the book of Genesis was written like at least 2,000 years before Christ, when people they didn't have a scientific framework at all. So it speaks to its own culture, and it addresses questions that were prevalent in the day, like the relationship between the created order and God. So Genesis wants to talk about that. If the tree in your yard is not God. God is separate from the world. How many gods are there? There's only one, and he's very intelligent, and he's organized. And human beings are made in the image of God. So if you're wanting to sort of just assume that all truth is scientific truth, and you want to plug the story of Genesis into your own scientific framework, I think you're asking the wrong question, because the book of Genesis was not written to answer the questions that we have. It was written to answer the more primal or sort of fundamental questions about how many gods are there, what's the relationship between God and the world, and what role do human beings have in relation to this God who created the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So I do have a second question, which shifts a little bit to what we were just discussing, but this is for Dr. Goligher here. As a doctor, how do you react to some people putting their full faith in God and not believing in any medical assistance? Mm-hmm. Tough question.
Well, I think it's a sad thing to do, because, science and medicine are one of the great gifts that God has given to humanity, and in many ways, science and medicine are appropriate and rational responses to the kind of world that God made. So this is why it's so critical that these ideas of primary and secondary causation that I was talking about. There are streams of kind of maybe not so much mainstream Christian belief or other religions that really only think about things in terms of primary causation and see God just doing everything and don't recognize the order that supervenes on the world that he upholds. But recognizing that order empowers us as the royal rulers over the world to understand the world that God made and to use it intelligently for our good and for the good of other creatures. So I think in many ways medicine and science are deeply coherent with a Christian belief, and where you see people struggling to reconcile them, I think it's because they don't really understand either the biblical worldview or the role that science has in the natural order.
Yeah, thank you. Now, my next question here is, if we are to accept the fine-tuning argument that you were describing earlier, it only gives proof of a creator. How do you know that creator is the Christian God?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go
Glenn,
first?
would you like to speak first?
I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, exploring these kinds of issues is like kind of a staged process where, some of the evidence will point to intelligence behind the created order, right? But it doesn't tell you, how many gods there are or what kind of a God it necessarily is. I mean, I assume that you would have to think that that God was pretty organized and was ordered in order to create mathematical rules and stuff. But people who are Christians have gone one stage further, and that's something that's only been touched upon through some of the things that Dr. Goligher was saying about, the evidence of the integrity of the New Testament and those kinds of things. So you need to ask the big questions about God, but then you need to sort of say, well, what about the Christian understanding of God? What's the evidence for the teachings of Jesus? The evidence in the New Testament that talks about him doing miracles. And so it's kind of a sliding scale, and you have to sort of take each one as it comes. Having said that, though, and I want to be quick because I want to get over to Dr. Goligher, but Christians also believe in the Spirit of God, that God is present, and that when the truth of the gospel is spoken, that there's this kind of a voice that's speaking in your head that's confirming the truth of what's being said. And it's a little bit maybe mystical, but some of you might be feeling that right now. Like they just kind of say, this is just a talk, but something more is happening to me. And that wouldn't surprise Christians at all, because it's the Spirit of God that draws people ultimately to faith in Jesus Christ. And so that's also part of the mechanism, is that God has this power to draw us to himself. That doesn't solve the question about different religions, because people in other religions would say the same thing, but it's part of what Christians believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually that passage that I read from Acts 17, where Paul is speaking to the audience of philosophers at Athens, he points to the kind of natural knowledge that we have of God, the world that God made, but then he cites the resurrection as the now clear, present, and compelling evidence to recognize the lordship of the one who claims to be the Lord of all things, Jesus Christ. And it was the resurrection that turned the 12 disciples of Christ from sort of quivering, fearful, uncertain, shaken disciples who've just seen their master crucified into fearless, confident, zealous, passionate preachers of the message that Jesus was the Messiah. And everywhere they went, they said, we are witnesses of his resurrection. It's really ultimately the resurrection on which Christianity stands or falls. And I would encourage you, if you're questioning, okay, maybe I can see God. I don't know, this whole Christianity thing, at the end of the day, what Christian faith stands or falls on is this question of, did Jesus rise from the dead? Because if he did, that vindicates all of his claims about himself. And if he didn't, well, then there's really not much reason to believe that he has much to offer. It's that resurrection, it says, that justifies him and also justifies us. So that becomes the critical issue. And we're not really here to talk about the resurrection tonight. We can talk about it after. But I would say, in terms of evidence-based faith, it's the evidence for the resurrection that grounds Christians in their faith.
Which is a great segue for our next question, which is, what, in your opinion, is the most compelling scientific evidence in favor of God's existence?
Well, maybe I can start with that. I would speak to the fact that where everyone is now forced to recognize that this universe had a beginning. I mean, that is something that nobody, before, I think it was 1917, 1918, when the physical evidence for that began to emerge. Before that, people were quite insistent that, there was no reason to believe that, and people didn't want to believe that because they recognized the theistic implications of that. But, once the evidence about astronomical evidence for the beginning of the universe began to emerge, Einstein famously said that he'd actually changed his equations because he thought they were leading him to believe that there had to be a beginning, and he's like, no, that can't possibly be the case because that would mean there'd have to be a God and all this. So he actually changed his equations, and he got it wrong for that reason, and he famously regretted it. You can read about this in lots of different books about the history of science. So to me, the fact that the universe had a beginning, I'm like, where could it possibly have come from? It has to come from something outside this universe. It has to come from something personal because non-persons don't have agency, and it has to come from a being who's infinite, like incredibly powerful, wise, and all-knowing. So just the fact that the universe exists, the fact that we're all here, never mind the evidence from biology and fine-tuning and all this, just to me, all speaks to it all by itself that the truth about God's existence is almost irresistible.
I'll be super quick about this because I'm not a scientist, and so my answer wouldn't be have any more authority than that of anybody else in the room. But to me, it would include the moral argument for the existence of God, that we are created with a sense of right and wrong that came from somewhere, that it's very hard to sort of explain on purely evolutionary terms in terms of human survival. And then the fact that the margins are so narrow for the existence for creating a world where life like this could exist. And Dr. Goligher mentioned the alternative to that is this multiverse, but what's the evidence for the multiverse? I mean, it takes far more faith to believe in a multiverse, to me, than it does to believe in God.
So our next question, maybe we'll start with Dr. Goligher here. What is your opinion on humans attempting to modify natural life processes, such as genome editing, and how do you think God perceives this?
Thorny bioethical questions. Love it. Well, so yeah, we tread on sacred ground here. I think in the first place, these kinds of efforts are entirely consistent with our God-given commission to fill the earth and subdue it, to understand the world that He created and to exercise control over it for the good of humanity, for the good of other creatures, and for the glory of God. So it's very much consistent with that kingly kind of role that Scripture describes. The critical issue is that as technology increases, as we have greater and greater capability, we need to be very careful to protect the sacredness of persons. And so where these technologies are used to treat people as an end in themselves, to act with the interests and recognizing the sacredness and intrinsic value of persons, that's entirely appropriate. But where they start to be used, where we start treating other human beings as means to ends, that's when we start to get into territory where we're acting wrongly, I would argue. And that really relies on the notion that humans have intrinsic and inherent and incalculable value. So, you raised a really significant question about the appropriate limits of science and technology that, it's difficult to answer in one straightforward paragraph. But I would say this is the line, is that we must never treat one another merely as means to ends. And some of the kinds of ways in which these technologies might be used, just for example, human cloning, you cannot avoid treating another being as a means to an end when you're doing that. And so this is the fundamental problem. And how I would begin to draw a line around what's appropriate and what's not. But at the same time, the drive to develop these tools is so significant because we can do so much good with them as well. So this is the gift that God's given us, the freedom of the will and moral judgment to exercise wise stewardship over the world that He made.
Can I just add a footnote to that, because this is a part where I think the Bible comes into it, and I agree with everything that you said, Ewan. But I think there are times when the Bible does kind of want to address certain issues. Like, for example, a lot of people think that it will be possible one day to prolong human life by 2 or 3 times by genetic modifications. And to me, the story of creation in Genesis talks about God ordaining that we would only live for a certain period of time. And it's kind of God's way of saying, let's implement some damage control. These people are a bit out of control, and we just want to make sure that they're not granted immortality. And I can't think of anything that would create and foster selfishness than somebody creating something that would allow you to live for like 500 years. And I can assure you that it won't be people in the third world without a lot of money who are going to be at the front of the line to get whatever it is that could be done theoretically to enhance the length of human life. So sometimes these ethical issues do come in and address things from a biblical perspective, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. So let's switch it up. We'll have Glenn start for this question. The question is, do miracles happen in this time, and can these be investigated scientifically?
She chose me, I don't know.
I-
Okay. Yeah.
Good luck.
Yes, yes, I think absolutely. I mean, I think that Dr. Goligher was very sort of sound and sane when he talked about it not being the norm, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, God can do whatever God wants to do, and I think that there are miracles that happen today, and you know, I have kind of firsthand contact with some people who have experienced those kinds of miracles. But the danger, as I see it, is only seeing God where the miracles happen and not seeing God behind the natural processes as well, because he's ordained that those are kind of govern the way that things happen. So yeah, absolutely, I believe in miracles and that they happen today.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you can never investigate a miracle scientifically because it's a one-off kind of event. And that's the fundamental problem in terms of miracles. So like even a claim about a resurrection, you're never going to design an experiment of some kind where you know, test whether resurrections happen or not, because it's a one-off kind of event. The evidence for those kinds of events depends on the evidence of witness testimony, much like you might rely on in a court of law. So there are some questions that are not amenable to the scientific method. Moral questions, aesthetic questions, and questions about whether miracles have happened. But that doesn't mean that we can't find good reasons to believe them. I'll be honest with you, I'm generally pretty skeptical when people tell me they've seen a miracle. Maybe that's just the scientist in me. But I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, simply because I understand that the natural order is upheld by a God who's fully in control and therefore can manipulate that order when he sees fit. But in his kindness, he rarely does so, because it's the predictability of the world that makes it livable for us. So and makes science possible.
All right, for our next question is, because God made everything, as a scientist, do you believe God created the Big Bang? And did God create the atoms we're made of?
Yeah, yes and yes. Yeah. That's what I think the Big Bang is, God
Right.
creating.
Right, yeah, next question here. Quick and easy, love that. If Christian faith is evidence-based, what do you think of Hebrews 11:1, which says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see."
Well, I'm glad there's a biblical scholar here.
All right, Glenn, up to you.
Well, yeah, I was interested in how you kind of nuanced the issue of faith, Ewan, and I thought it was right on. I like to use the analogy of if somebody makes like if I were to go to that board there and draw a figure of a gladiator by using dots, and you'd have to join the dots in order to get the picture of a gladiator. Is that a faith-based exercise, or is that something that the evidence has led you to do? And I think that a lot of the hypothesizing that we do, I mean, there are people who just kind of say, no, you can't join the dots because we don't know. There might be other dots. You sort of say, well, look, you know, I can already see a gladiator, and if you join those dots, you are. So I think that faith is maybe kind of more on a sliding scale. And I mean, there may be some philosophers here, and I'm a sort of an amateur person who's interested in philosophy, but I think philosophers will tell you that, I mean, foundationalism is intellectually pretty dead. And it takes faith to believe that we're all, you know, that what we're doing right here isn't just kind of an exercise in the matrix, right? So everybody has faith. And if you don't have faith, then you're probably just kind of wondering what in the world you can believe, sort of like Descartes did in his exercise at the beginning of the Enlightenment. So faith comes with the territory. And to me, as a Christian, and I bet you would agree with this, Ewan, is that it takes less faith to believe in God and in the resurrection of Jesus Christ to me than it does not to believe just because the evidence is kind of pushing in that way. So I think faith has a lot to do with drawing conclusions from the limited data that's available to us at any given point in time. And that always calls for adjustment, but is joining the dots an exercise in faith, or is it something that dots are welcoming you to join, and does it make intellectual sense to join the dots so you can see the gladiator, if the dots are actually wanting to point you to the gladiator?
Yeah, and if I could add to that, as I reflect on Hebrews 11, that's the opening verse to a passage in Scripture which is referred to as the Hall of Faith, because it goes on to recount people who exercise great faith in their life. And as you reflect on the lives of the people listed in that chapter, people like Abraham, people like Moses, Rahab, prophets, so on, their faith was not irrational. They had reasons to believe. So, for example, Abraham had multiple personal encounters with God. Moses had a personal encounter with God where he saw a bush that was burning but not being consumed. He saw the plagues in Egypt. He saw God separate the Red Sea. Now, of course, we are trusting the record here, so we have to critically examine whether the record's reliable. But if taking for granted that the record is reliable, Moses had things happen in his life which gave him reasons to believe that God was real and that he was there and that he ought to serve him as the leader of the people of Israel. So the challenge of faith is not so much rationality. What's celebrated in that chapter is the challenge of courage. It takes courage to live by faith. It's easier in some ways to ignore the things that force us to believe. But what's celebrated in that chapter is courage. So the virtues of a faithful person are not merely that they're rational, but they're also courageous. And the kind of world that we live in, a kind of world that's fallen, a kind of world where there's a great deal of suffering and pain, and I am witness to that both personally and professionally, requires a great deal of courage to look at the evidence for God and say, God, I believe even though I cannot understand why things are the way they are. That requires not only rationality, it requires courage. And that's what's celebrated in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. But it says of Moses that he looked at the reward, so that made him willing to suffer reproach for a season. He was willing to sacrifice and pay a cost because he really believed that these things were true. And so that is the reward of faith. But nothing about faith is easy. Easy to talk about faith in science. In some ways, science is easier than faith, the life of faith. But there's no question that Hebrews 11:1 is suggesting us to just blind trust, because that's not what's celebrated in that chapter.
No, thank you so much for that. The next question I have is, as a Christian, how do you recommend approaching discussions about faith and science in a casual conversation with someone who doesn't believe in Christianity? I'll leave you to decide who to pick for this one.
Like, you're a pastor, Glenn.
Yeah, I mean, I would just point out the kind of the false dichotomy that Ewan was pointing out before, and that, I mean, everybody has faith. I mean, it's like, getting into the airplane that Dr. Goligher was talking about at the beginning, right? So faith isn't something that is unique to Christians. It's something that everybody employs. And I think you could even mount an argument, as we were just talking about before, that, I mean, to me, it takes more faith not to believe in God than it does to believe in God because of the data. So I would say break down the dichotomy, the perceived dichotomy between faith is, check your brain at the door and just kind of believe what is completely unreasonable, which is kind of the wrong way to look at the relationship between faith and evidence.
Yeah, that's really well said. I also just think it's, when those conversations arise, I think that's why if you're a believer, it's important to be well read and to know the ways in which science supports Christian belief and how you handle these kinds of conflicts that arise, because people do have questions about these sorts of things. And so I think just being well read and being well prepared to talk about the issues is really important. So I definitely encourage you to grab the handout that Dr. Taylor provided, because there's the list of different Christian approaches to science. There's also a great short bibliography, some useful YouTube videos that are referenced there, just a way into this conversation about faith and science so that you're equipped and ready to talk about it.
Yeah, and if you can't see from the back, there's a table up here at the front, so you won't miss it. All right, so the next question, maybe I'll ask Glenn first, is if God created the world, who created God?
Ewan, how about you? No, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think, you kind of have to make a category shift, because at a certain point, you have to affirm, it helps, I think, to affirm the eternality of God, and to say that, there's a difference between the created world and God. And that's certainly something that Genesis 1 is all about. I mean, from the very beginning, it says, in the beginning, God created stuff. And it wants to make a difference between, the natural world and this God who stands outside of it. I know John Lennox has a YouTube clip on the whole thing, who created God? And I think it's a common question that people ask, but my answer is not very robust or mature, and maybe Ewan's is better.
Yeah, I would say that the way to think about this is we have to get into metaphysics a little bit. So there's basically two kinds of things that exist. There are necessary beings and contingent beings. Contingent beings exist by virtue of something else. They depend on something else for their existence. Contingent beings don't have to exist. There's nothing illogical about their non-existence. So, for example, the number 4 kind of has, it just kind of has to exist. It's a necessary kind of abstract object. When we talk about God, the question is God a necessary kind of being or a contingent kind of being? And the Christian claim about God, the God that we propose to worship, is that he is a being who exists necessarily, that there's no possible world in which God couldn't exist, because that's just what God is, a logically necessary being. One way to get to that is to think about a famous Christian teacher, Thomas Aquinas, talked about this argument of the unmoved mover. So the idea is that every cause has an effect, so every effect has a cause, and you keep pushing back until you get back to the uncaused cause. That's the first cause, the cause that exists just by virtue of the necessity of its own nature. And that's just what we mean by God. When we're talking about God, by definition, we're talking about a being who exists necessarily. And so God is the explanation of his own existence as a necessary being. He doesn't need to be created. He doesn't need a cause because he's an uncaused cause by definition.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now we're going to be asking the very last question for this evening, and that is, in both of your opinions, can Christians tend to be over-reliant on God of the gaps arguments to defend the existence of God?
Well, I mean, so God of the gaps arguments are arguments that you make when you don't have an alternative explanation. So you're just like, I don't really know how to explain why, risk factor X causes disease Y. Well, I'm just going to blame it on God. That is a kind of an extreme and absurd example of a God of the gaps argument. So sometimes people say, well, the only reason you believe in God is because you just don't know how things came into existence. So therefore you appeal to God as a kind of gap explanation. And once science figures it out, you're going to lose your basis for believing in God. That's the threat that's attached to a God of the gaps argument. And so, it's certainly always a logical risk or possibility for us to, just turn to God when we can't explain. But I think, again, when we understand the difference between secondary causation and primary causation, we understand a little bit more about what we're trying to explain. Are we trying to explain the relations between secondary causes and effects, or are we trying to explain the relationship between primary and secondary causes? And science will potentially always give us explanations of secondary causation and never give us explanations of primary causation. And so we just have to understand the limits of what we're trying to explain. And ultimately, when we talk about the beginning of the universe, the reason I don't think appealing to God in that case is a God of the gaps argument is because that's the only reasonable explanation, just by the nature of things, not so much just because I don't have another explanation. If there was a physical cause for the current universe, then there would have been a universe before this. But when we talk about the Big Bang, we're talking about the beginning of space-time universe. So by definition, there was no physical cause before that. So it's just by nature of the thing we're trying to explain that I think there's no God of the gaps argument when I appeal to God's existence as an explanation for the existence of the universe. That was a bit rambling, but I hope it made a modicum of sense.
I think it's kind of a dangerous way to approach things, is to attribute to God the gap stuff, because, and maybe that's why there are so few people who, or there are less people who believe in God now than before, because science has done such a good job of explaining things. But I mean, there's no reason to have that distinction, because the natural phenomena that are around us, in many cases, are so incredibly complex that it's the stuff that isn't part of the gap that also can point to God. I had to chuckle when the question was asked, because I've taken some courses in archaeology and have dabbled in it a bit, and I noticed that if archaeologists can't explain an object that they discover, they say it must be a religious object, and it's kind of the same gaps thing. We don't know what to do with it, so let's call it a religious object, and there's kind of irony and silliness in that at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for our panel. I invite you all to give a big round of applause. Sure, go ahead.
This is the end of the Relevant series, and some of you, I hope, will be joining Christianity Explored. But if not, there are a couple of little black and red brochures there in addition to the handout. One of them says, who is Jesus? And the other says, what is the gospel? So if you're new to Christianity and you kind of want a bird's eye view, there are several of those little pamphlets there that would give you more of the basic answers to the things that we've kind of more or less assumed in tonight's session.
Yeah, and there is a lot more other ways you can connect with us further after our Relevant series. So whether you're listening online or here in person, invited by a friend, or are part of a Christian fellowship here on campus, I invite you to have further conversations with anyone you know. If you don't know anyone, feel free to turn to the person next to you and ask around there. But we do have some information and handouts there as well. And at the same time, we also have Christianity Explored, like I mentioned earlier. And so, I encourage you to connect with us further. And all of our relevant talks, if you wanted to learn more about them, are recorded on YouTube. I also wanted to acknowledge the clubs that we collaborated with for Relevant series. So we had InterVarsity Chinese Christian Fellowship, Mandarin Chinese Christian Fellowship, Wycliffe College, Mission Hub, Every Nation Church, Christ the King, Power to Change, and Campus Worship. So lots of fellowships on campus if you would like to get connected or learn more about Christianity. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday night. Thank you, speakers, as well, for joining our panelists. There's still snacks up there. Thank you to the team for organizing the event, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yeah, likewise, Glenn.